This is International Master Eric Kislik. Today we're going to be looking at Game 8 between Ding Liren and Gukesh with the World Championship match tied 3.5, 3.5 with one win for both players. This was the fourth white game for the world champion Ding Liren, and in this game we had a very typical English. I actually had played this exact line against a former U.S. champion, Alex Yermolinsky, and I was also a bit surprised by what he played. So, c4, e5, typical English, knight c3, bishop to b4. I've also liked playing this with black and with white. Very interesting lines. Knight d5, and the former U.S. champion played bishop to e7 against me, which surprised me. And, of course, one of the key points is that he's trying to make my knight move for the third time when I recapture, or when I capture on e7, and he can take either with the knight or with the queen. Now, if you wait for knight f6 or you play a line that provokes knight f6, then they'll have to take with the queen on e7. So I'll show you one line. One line I looked at is d4. Take, knight f6. Now, this is a typical line where white actually gets the queen to take. So take, bishop to g5, knight c6, the queen just drops back. So I'm keeping this pressure here. Now, the one downside is even if you actually take on f6, are you really going to be better there? Current theory says no, you really don't get much of an edge. The problem is that you're doing all of this just to basically say, hey, I gave them those isolated pawns on the king side, but at the same time, black has good development and is going to develop all of his pieces to good squares. So let me show you kind of a main line here. Knight e5. Let's say I go c5. This is a typical move, trying to kind of pat down the dark squares, weaken the dark squares a bit here. Castles, e3. You just drop the bishop back. Knight to e4. A nice little intermediate move, hitting the queen. C takes d6. I go queen a3. Yeah, and white tries to play for the strong centralized knight. Of course, black challenges it with knight to c6. Take, bishop to d3. Notice everything is guarded here, although here I can play h5. So that's one line. That would be a line where you take on e7 with the queen. In the game, he played knight f3, d6, g3. I thought that was a very interesting choice. I haven't really seen much of this. And then c6 was played. Now, it might seem a little irrational to simply go back with the knight, but the argument would be, well, maybe I have a good opportunity to play something like d4, or in other circumstances, b4, b5, kind of increasing the scope of the English bishop when we put it on g2, give it a good strong diagonal. They play f5, trying to discourage d4, so you can bypass the pawn with e4. Bishop g2. Yeah, now I'm looking at b4. Castle, b4. And go rook b1. Yeah, I mean, this was just an entirely different type of position. Now one could argue this could have been an interesting way to play, simply because very few top players have extensive experience playing the Dutch or Dutch-like structures, outside of maybe Nakamura. So anyway, I continued the line a little bit here. C takes d5, knight takes d5. Good capture, challenging the knight here on c3. I just defend it. Bishop d2, bishop f6, queen c2. Okay, guarding everything. Yeah, rook b7 and rook fb8. And I said black is okay here. But once again, just leads to a very different character of position. So knight takes e7 played, and knight takes e7. Now, this was really, really interesting because I guess I had never really studied this structure very much, but of course the idea is he can go f6 to secure the e5 pawn and go for the ideal pawn center, bishop e6 and then d5. That's the standard plan here. Now, I will say that I didn't quite like the way that Ding played. I would have liked something a little more dynamic, maybe b4 right away, bishop e6, d3, then there's that f6 move. By the way, interesting plan here. I could sack the pawn to go rook b1, playing against that b7 pawn there. Bishop d2, I'm getting the pawn back over here. Well, whenever I want to get it back. Check. I can take here and go queen b5. So certainly a playable continuation there, no doubt about it. But I thought that was a little more testing to play b4 there. Bishop g2, and then f6. Yeah, very nice idea. Very nice idea. Just playing with these ideas. Bishop e6, d5, pawns on d5 and e5. The ideal pawn center. You can check out my video, The Importance of the Ideal Pawn Center. And you know what's really crazy is that was an essential concept that every single player in my generation learned when they were between 1400 and 1600 or even less. And if you do a search on YouTube for videos on the ideal pawn center, I think it's probably just my video. So it's kind of crazy. A lot of people sometimes distance themselves from the fundamentals, which of course are fundamentals for a reason. They're very important. All right, so once again right here, I thought Ding should try something a little bit different than castling. His play here looked a little mechanical. It was a little bit strange to me. I mean, he did succeed in in making this game quite interesting, but a couple of his moves I didn't like. So when I was watching the game, I thought queen c2, you play b4, thought that was the most dynamic way of playing. Also, actually, another point worth bearing in mind when you play queen c2, you do stop e4 from ever being played. You get some more possibilities of maybe you play d4 in some lines, like d4, e4. You go for your own ideal pawn center. So I also looked at this. You go b4, d5, queen c2, defending the pawn. Bishop e6. There's that standard d3 move, simply defending. Knight a6, a3. Castle, castle, queen d7. Now, a very important principle from Mark Dvoretsky's books, and an excellent work, he calls this the Botvinnik principle. When you identify that your opponent is going to trade off your light-squared bishop, like with bishop h3, well, what about putting all your pawns on light squares to anticipate the loss of the bishop so that your remaining bishop has great scope? So e4, quite a nice move here. Now, sometimes what black might do in a position like this is not trade off the bishop, but yeah, he most likely is going to go for that quite soon. Bishop to e3, hitting that pawn on a7, b6, defending it, just improving the worst place piece. Black plays his last developmental move. Yeah, I looked at h4, h6, queen a4 being slightly annoying. And I said black can play knight b8 and be just about equal here. But yeah, I mean, good dynamic play here by white. I think this was the right way to play. I think if Ding had played this, there's a chance that Gukesh gets a little bit uncomfortable. You know, probably his supercomputer analysis with black would have said equal, but it's just a little bit hard to play. A couple of weird moves that you have to play. You have to play b6 and knight b8 and just kind of keep the position under control. It's not so easy to do that. All right, so castles played by Ding Liren. Bishop e6 gains the tempo against the pawn. Yeah, I was kind of surprised that Ding didn't just play d3 at a certain point. I just thought d3 is almost always what you play in a typical English. So that did surprise me. All right, so b3, and here Gukesh creates the ideal pawn center. Pawns on d5 and e5, and they're very restrictive, and you basically ask white, okay, how are you going to try to challenge these pawns? Now, this was a pretty cool idea. He actually just sacked the pawn, which once again kind of surprised me, because I thought, all right, well, the standard move in an English is you play d3 at some point, you know, like I said, d3, queen c2, all that kind of stuff. He played bishop a3. Yeah, that was a really interesting move. I said it's interesting, but you need to be sensitive about the undefended a3 bishop. So, you know, there might be lines later where there's stuff like, you know, like queen a5 in some lines. Not now, of course, because of that knight. But, you know, a5, a4 type lines where the rook is lined up with the bishop. So you got to be very sensitive to that. Now, fortunately, this move would be a mistake if they took. Take. I think the simplest here, here's a kind of cool line I was looking at. Queen c2, let's say the bishop goes back, d4, and if they take, I think I have a bunch of different moves, but let's say I play this here and takes, and just look at all this colossal pressure right here. If they try something like knight d7, bishop h3, here you can see the power of the bishop pair. Because in almost all of the variations that we looked at, or that we have looked at so far, the bishop pair has been blunted, and that's exactly what an ideal pawn center can do. It can blunt the scope of those bishops. So this is what Ding was hoping for. Yeah, I mean, that would have been fantastic, but of course, you know, he didn't go for that. So castles, good sound move. Yeah, once again, I was just a little confused by rook c1. I mean, the computer doesn't hate it, but it just doesn't feel consistent because you're sort of left asking, well, okay, question number one. If you look at it from the perspective of comparison, first of all, why would you not just go d3? Aren't we going to play d3 basically no matter what? That's the first question. But second of all, can't the rook be more effective somewhere else? Like, let's say, I don't know, potentially on d1 or on b1. So I said it's not clear what white benefits from playing rook c1. Why would he not play d3? And here I said this plan of going for this, and then you play e4. I just thought that's the standard plan here. You improve the knight, you play your break, and you know one of the problems black has is if you play d4, you have to have a response for f4. So here's the line I looked at: knight e1. I go knight c2. Black plays a5, just like in the game. Kind of that the rook eyeing the bishop if there's a chance to maybe play a4 somewhere. e4, d4, f4. That's exactly what I was talking about, that f4 shot. Now, what black should do is again, play his own break. White plays a break, black plays a break. And I said take bishop h3, and I said black is okay after knight a6, but I think that if the game had once again followed this path, just like what we looked at in the other line with the Botvinnik principle, if either of these lines had come up, a couple of things could have happened. Gukesh could have gotten lower on time, and he also could have just maybe tried something a bit unconventional that wasn't that good. Now, here I didn't quite like Gukesh's move. He played a5, and it's not a bad move in itself, but here's the thing. He's going to have to play rook e8 no matter what. So because he needs rook e8 no matter what, from the perspective of pure flexibility, you just play the move. You just play rook e8. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Like, what exactly do we want to do from the white side? I looked at a very aggressive pawn sacrifice. And I admit, this can be hard to play in a game where you might think to yourself, well, do I really want to sack? Now, I would say that if I was playing a higher rated player, I would actually quite like the sacrifice because it has, here I'm sacrificing, this is a second pawn, right? Yeah. I'm sacrificing two pawns here. Now, what I like in this line is that I am giving them a bit of a scare after this d4 move. You know, I go d4, and I'm trying to blast this all open, plus I have stuff like bishop a1. I have different things I can attack. Remember what we talked about with the ideal pawn center blunting our bishop pair? Well, now we have two crisscrossing, bishops here who are pretty aggressively positioned. I go bishop a1, rook b1, hitting that b7 pawn. You can see all these passive moves for black. Now, well, I do have a majority here, 4 versus 3. A majority is a form of a superiority that you try to use. So you go e4, and then you go f4, and then you can go f5, and I mean you have all kinds of aggressive tries here. So I was looking at this. Yeah, and I said this leads to like a pretty wild position, but yeah, this is what I think black should have been going for. Now, probably Ding would have looked for a safer way to play than sacrificing two pawns, but that would have been by far the sharpest way that the game could have continued. All right, so Ding played knight e1. Yeah, I mean, I thought knight e1 was a fine move. I mean, strategically, he did a pretty good job. I was also thinking, what if I just take and I go knight e1, and here I go f4, and then I go d3. So very standard kind of hyper-modern strategy. You let them get the big center, and then you challenge it as much as possible. What was I looking at? Knight a6, knight b4, going after that a2 pawn. Take. Yeah, just a lot of simplification occurring in this line I showed here. Take, rook a1, take, knight c2. I'm going to grab that pawn on b4. Should be pretty equal after this. Yeah, it just gets hard to play when you have this much to defend. Yeah, rook a7, rook d7, rook a3, king f7. Yeah, so even though in this position white is up a pawn, you're stuck, stuck in a pretty defensive posture with that rook on c3 hitting two different targets. So most likely black will win a pawn back and it'll be equal. Knight e1, good move. There's the rook e8 move that I said had to be played. Now there was an interesting discussion I saw here about the move knight to d3. Knight to d3, trying to come into c5. Very interesting choice. Like a nice, safe way to play. And one of the problems is if you go b6, that might also be a bit of a weakening move itself, because I may gain access to some new squares in that line. So Ding ended up playing f4. I said Ding's pawn break was clever, but bailing out made more sense here to trade off one of black's knights. Yeah, it just looks a little awkward to be blocking your d pawn, but it is, in my opinion, it's a perfectly natural human move. So knight c5, take, rook c8. Yeah, this is I think this is a very sensible position for white. a4, I can just drop back. And queen d7. Yeah, the problem is this is our unopposed bishop with the bishop pair. It is solid, but it's not really hitting anything. So it's hard to argue that white's really better there. All right, so f4 played by Ding here. And here another interesting question. Should he go for e4? Now I go knight f5, trying to hop in here for the fork. I play knight c2, guarding the square. Take, knight a6. Yeah, everything seems to be guarded. Let's say this move, knight to b4, trying to open up the a file and go for some knight d4 possibilities. So here's the line I looked at. Take, knight to d4, take. You can see I have a couple of different things I can attack in this line. Bishop f5 and queen e3. I think black's gonna win back one of the pawns and be equal here. All right, so e takes f4 played in the game. Yeah, so Ding at least succeeded in undermining the ideal pawn center here. Rook takes. Now this was very interesting for Gukesh here. Take, knight g6, rook e4. I thought that was a kind of a bold move. I saw commentators talking about this like, yo, the obvious rook e4, of course. Yeah, it sometimes looks scary to have your rook in a position like that because you think, oh, it's unstable. Now, it could have been attacked by f5. I didn't see much discussion of this, even though I thought this was the most natural move. Why? It's advancing the majority and trying to weaken white structure. So let's say f5, rook e3, f4. And then I have isolated a pawn, so that is some achievement. And it's quite possible that if Gukesh wanted to try to play for the win here, let's say Ding was playing this position on move 21 with 25 minutes left, this could be very awkward to play, even with the bishop pair. Simply just, undefended rook on e3, the isolated pawn on g3. That could be very awkward. There might be lines where there's stuff like h5, h4, trying to swing the rook in. So I thought f5 made a lot of sense, advancing black's majority. Knight a6, that's also a bold move because there are lines where you go knight b4 if the bishop drops back. There are lines with knight c5. Now, I must admit, I did think knight c2 was not as natural as just playing this move and having the double fianchetto. Let's say I just play here, hitting that rook. I simply defend with knight c2. I go bishop to d4. Yeah, they're not able to take. I can take here and take here. So knight a6, a3, d3. Yeah, now I'm kind of guarding everything. Very interesting little piece formation here with everything guarded. Yep, here's this line I was mentioning where they trade off the bishops. Knight g4, hitting the rook. Now I hit their piece, they hit mine. Bing, bing. Drop the bishop back. Yeah, I think this position is basically equal. Now, it is interesting to note that white has a central majority of 2 versus 0, and this is something that actually came up quite a bit in the World Championship match between Carlsen and Caruana quite a while back. And the argument from white's point of view was, well, my central majority should be able to do something. But the hard part is how exactly do you advance it? Because that pawn on c5 is stopping the d pawn, and the pawn on f6 is stopping the e pawn from going far. So, you know, we could say that that White's controlling more squares in the center. White has greater central presence, but you might not actually be going anywhere with it, so that's probably just about equal. All right, knight c2 was played. Bunch of different options here. Queen c7 was played. Good move to make the opponent spend some time thinking, especially way ahead on time. I said this was solid and made sense with the time situation. I did prefer knight e5 and considered it a better move with a similar idea. Let's say knight e5, knight e3, knight b4. Pretty nasty looking knights for this kind of a position. I mean, if Ding has to play a move like this, like rook a1, and like be countering these knight hops, that could be very awkward to play. So I was looking at stuff like this and I was thinking to myself, like, yeah, that's, you know, it's not easy. It's really not easy to play this kind of a position. Hit the bishop. Bishop drops back. My bishop is still guarding e3. Yeah, I thought even with the extra pawn for black, it's probably only a draw because the bishop pair is very good and the a pawn's weak. But this was the other possibility if they play f5. I can go here. Now if they try to interfere with knight b4, I can play c5. But yeah, all of these ideas looked pretty dangerous. Take. Yeah, this is a fun little move. Going for knight f7. Had a fun move here as well. Exchange sack. Queen h5. I thought that was pretty fun. Take. Again, super dynamic, interesting position. I can play bishop e4 here. Really interesting position all around. I do have that pass pawn on d6 that's supported by the bishop, so I don't think that Ding would be worse here. Queen c7 was played. Knight d4. All right, so strong centralized piece for Ding here. Bishop f7. I think Gukesh has felt he was very solid here. d3, good consolidating move. Now Ding has consolidated his central structure and defended everything. Yeah, if something like this, I just defend. I go here, knight c5, take. Knight f3, let's say. Yeah, that's very solid. It's very solid. I certainly think that if Gukesh had gone for a certain line like this, it could have just been awkward for Ding to find moves. So he went for knight e5, and Ding just tried to play safely here and challenge the knight. He went knight f3. So White fights against the strong centralized knight on e5. Yeah, I mean, maybe queen d2 and rook f1 is a little simpler here. Knight f5, g4. Yeah, I mean, the one downside in this line is that I am down a pawn, but I get the pawn back because I have this bishop takes move. Take. Yeah, I said this position was ultimately equal, but I think he was going for simplicity. He was trying to keep it as safe as possible. Yeah, so knight d7. That did strike me as passive. Thought this would be more aggressive. So you try to challenge everything here. I go take. Go bishop e4. And I got to make sure that my e-pawn stays safe here. So queen c2. Let's say I play this. Now I have the idea of, going d4 after this. But I do have to give back. I have to give up that pawn. Here I had a fun little move. Desperado. Take. Yeah, again, just major simplification. So that was a fun little line. Anyway, let's go back to the game. Knight d7. I thought that was a little bit passive. I thought that White may have chances for an edge. And here I think the obvious move is just bishop to b2. Again, double fianchetto. Black's majority is not going anywhere. If you go b5, take queen b6, I go bishop d4. You're stuck with two isolated pawns. So I thought this was the obvious way to play. Yeah, just a good position with the bishop pair. Again, can I really prove an edge here? Black is really solid. It's again the same scenario I described with this Carlsen-Caruana issue. Is White going to be better here? Maybe it's very hard to prove. All right, so b5 played here. Yeah, he blundered. He blundered. He just missed the intermediate check. And I thought it's better to just simply bring the queen up. Like, let's say I play this and I go knight d4. But yeah, it's a little scary with those pawns coming up. So takes. check, king f1, take. Yeah, and again, it was just this intermediate move that he missed, queen b6 check. Because now these pawns are roaming, the a2 pawn is weak, and Ding tried bishop b2. And I think better was just to increase the scope of the bishop. You know, you go for some exchanges, you're a little worse here. Just a little worse here, you get some exchanges. Take and bishop to d4. Now, he played the wrong knight, and I think the whole concept of codependent knights was not really understood by anybody in the game or commenting on the game. Because he's supposed to play it this way, and then he can play this, and here you can see how you can defend. Rook c8. You play rook c8, and now, you know, let's say this, and then rook c7, and there's no knight to actually attack, so black just wins here. So that was a blunder, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So rook c1 was played. Yeah, and the problem here is that, you know, like let's say he'd gone back this way. This is the move that exploits the codependent knights. Take. I can play bishop f2. Yeah, I mean, this certainly would have been the trickiest line. This certainly would have been the trickiest line. I was looking at some other stuff like b4. Yeah, I have some tactics here. I have some tactics here to stop everything. And then I can finally take. Bishop takes b2. Take, knight f3. Anyway, that line's not super important, but let me show you the most interesting part. So bishop b3, queen e1, and yeah, I think he just missed that if takes, there's queen c3. This should have been played. Bishop e6, queen f2 should have been a fatal pin. Bishop to e3, rook c7. Now, I heard people saying that knight e1 should have been impossible to find, but not really, because I have the d4, d5 threat, and in this line, I have bishop f4 and bishop h3. Again, codependency. And if you go here, what do we call this? A switchback. The bishop returns to where it previously was. So I simply take, and I'm up the piece, and you win the game. So you know, if you appreciate switchbacks, the topic discussed in great detail by John Nunn, that move is perfectly findable. So he goes knight c6. Now the problem here is so he's up the exchange for a pawn, and he goes king e1. Great move, bringing the king over. But then this is the logical continuation. You bring the king over so that all the pawns are frozen, and now you actually should be able to win this. You should be able to win this by taking the pawn and bringing the queen back. So he should have been able to win this, but he kind of chose a bit of a mousy plan. And now queen g2, we have the sideways pin along the second rank, and that leads only to a draw here. And what did he fail to do? He failed to challenge the strong centralized piece. You challenge it, put the bishop on b6 to hit the pawn, but now I am guarding everything. So had he gone into this ending, I believe that he would have been able to win this. Ending. Again, you know, it does take some work proving this with the computer, but the flaw here was not challenging the strong centralized piece. So queen d4, yeah, and I think he should have just gone for this line. I think he should have gone for this line. Queen g2, queen f2, queen d5. Yeah, once again the same line I was showing. You challenged a strong centralized knight. And now we got a draw. This was actually a very good play by both sides, leading to the draw here. Nothing you could really do. Let's say you played this, king h7. And I think Gukesh felt his position was safe. He felt his position was safe because these pawns are kind of nasty running up the board. But yes, this would have been a draw. This would have been a draw. So check, king h7, took the pawn. I did hear not just somebody, but a grandmaster telling me, oh, he should have played rook b2. Yeah, I don't think it'll really change anything though. Rook c1, queen b4. Yeah, once again, just kind of a good move using these sideways pin ideas. And so now he just trades the queens off, and this was only a draw. He forced the draw here, and then we got the check and takes, and it's only a draw. So they had the draw and the opposite colored bishop ending. Very wild game. I would say that some of the concepts that were missed in this game were just typical concepts that I talk about all the time that you won't really hear discussed anywhere else, just because they're advanced topics and not that many people speak to kind of an audience that's, let's say, 2,200 plus. But yeah, I mean, there was a sideways pin with Queen G2, as you can see. You know, this whole idea here was having that sideways pin. So that was one thing. There was also the issue with the codependent pieces. I showed that. This is a great example of the codependence of all these pieces. The knights depend on each other for defense, and the position collapses. The position collapses due to these pins here. There was also the issue of fighting against the strong centralized piece, which is a chapter in Chess Logic and Practice, the black book that's on the couch right behind me. And lastly, there was a switchback, a topic from Secrets of Practical Chess by John Nunn, a classic chess book. This line right here, let me show this line from this point. Bishop f4, bishop h3, codependent knights. Take, switchback, and wins. And wins, and pins, and wins. So a lot of advanced concepts where if you think about them clearly, you know, if they had been thought about clearly throughout all of this for Ding, would have been able to win the game. But, you know, can only use that going forward. So I'll catch you for the next one. Catch you for game number 9. Have a good one.